Welcome to this Wise Owl DAX for Power BI tutorial. In this part of the series we'll introduce some of the basic concepts of working with measures in DAX. We'll start with a quick comparison of measures versus calculated columns to see some of the key differences, and explain the all-important topic of filter context. We'll explain how you can organise the measures in your data model to make them easier to find and use. We'll explain how you can reference measures when you're creating new measures. We'll show you how to create a couple of measures for formatting properties in a visual. And then towards the end of the video, we'll introduce the concept of modifying filter context, which is an idea we'll talk about in a lot more detail in later parts of the series. So let's get started. To get started, I've created a new report, and as usual, the first thing I'll do is choose to import some data from an Excel workbook. I'll drop a link in the video description so you can download this movies file yourself. For now, I'll just double click on it to open up the import wizard. When that loads, I'm going to select all the tables from the movies workbook. There's way more data in here than we really need to demonstrate the basic measures we're going to create, but just for simplicity, I'll load it all into the data model. Okay, now that that's loaded, it might be worthwhile having a quick look at the model view, just so we can see how those tables are related. Now, if you watched a previous couple of videos in the series, you'll probably recognise this basic set of tables that we've created here. So we have a main central film table, and that's surrounded by some dimension tables such as director, genre, country, etc. We're not going to spend too much time in the model view, but one thing that might make our life a little bit easier is just hiding any of the ID fields which create the relationships between the various tables. So in the fields list, I'm going to search for any fields that contain the letters ID, and then I'm going to quickly highlight all those columns by holding down the Control key and clicking on them with the mouse. I do wish there was a faster way to do this, but I don't know of one yet. And then I'm going to click the little eye symbol to the right hand side, just to hide all of those from the report view. Having done that, we can head back to the report view, ready to start creating some measures. So far in this series, we've spent most of our time creating calculated columns, and although writing measures uses the same DAX language, the way measures work is quite different. To demonstrate this, let's head into the data view, and I'd like to start by creating a calculated column in the film table. So we'll work out each film's profit by subtracting the budget from the box office. Let's add a new column, and then when the formula bar is activated, I'll just zoom in a little bit so you can see more clearly what I'm typing. I need to give the column a name, so I'm going to call it profit, and I'll make it equal to the box office dollars minus the budget dollars. Remember, the convention for referencing columns in a table is to start with the table name, followed by the column name in some square brackets. When I press enter to create the calculated column, it produces a result for each individual row in the table. A calculated column uses something called row context to work out exactly which values to use for the results of the calculation on that row. And the results of the calculation are stored in the underlying data model. Now, measures work quite differently to that. Measures aren't so concerned with individual values for rows in a table. They're more concerned with aggregating data across a range of rows. So a good example of a measure might be one that calculates the average profit for a range of films. Now, although a measure doesn't create a different result for each row in a table, it does need to belong to a table. So we might as well create our first measure in the film table. Let's head to the Table Tools tab in the ribbon and choose to create a new measure. And when the formula bar is activated, again, just like with a calculated column, we need to give the measure a name. So I'm going to call mine average profit. I'm going to make this equal to a fairly simple expression. I'm going to use the average function and then refer to the profit column that we've just created. Now, it is possible using a measure to create the average profit without creating the separate profit calculated column first. And we'll have a look at how to create that sort of expression in a later video. For now, we'll just take the simple approach and use the column we've already built. When I press enter this time to create my measure, we won't see any results appear in the table itself. And that's because measures don't produce any results until you add them to a visualization in the report. So unlike a calculated column, measures don't store results or data in the data model. To see the results, we'll have to head back to the data view, the report view, and add some kind of visualization to see the results. Let's add a basic table, and then I can find my average profit measure and check the box next to it to insert that into the table. In the same way that a calculated column is affected by the row context, the result returned by a measure is influenced by the context in which it's evaluated. You'll hear several different terms used to describe the various contexts involved. There's filter context and query context, which collectively are known as the evaluation context according to Microsoft's documentation. To keep things simple, the term filter context is commonly used to refer to anything which influences the result of a measure. And we can affect the filter context of a visual in several different ways. A very simple way to change the filter context of this measure is to add another field to the table. So if I head over to the fields list and find the genre field, I can insert that into the values bucket of my table. And that's created multiple filter contexts in which the same measure is now evaluated. So on this action row of this table, the filter context determines that only rows of films where the genre is equal to the action genre are included in the average profit calculation. That same factor influences each of the other genres, and then at the bottom of the table we have a row that isn't affected by the genre filter context at all. So we're still seeing the grand total average profit, or the overall average profit, of all the films regardless of which genre they belong to. We can break this down even further if we switch this table into a matrix, for example. We could then add a field to the columns area. So let's maybe add the certificate field from the certificate table into the columns bucket. And now we've created an even more specific filter context for each cell in the table. We still have our grand overall average in the bottom right-hand corner here, so this isn't filtered by anything. But each of the individual cells in the table is now influenced by both the genre and the certificate filter. This probably all sounds quite straightforward and simple, but it's a deceptively simple concept which underpins everything we do with measures, and it's very easy to lose sight of this basic concept, so I'll be constantly reminding you of it throughout the rest of this series. So we've created a single measure so far, but in the real world, of course, you're likely to create many measures in the same data model. So it's worth taking some time to think about how to better organise them to make them easier to find in the fields list. Now, although measures do have their own dedicated symbol in the fields list, it's easy to lose sight of this amongst all of the other fields. One way to organise them is to create something called a display folder, so we could put all of our measures in a folder within the film table. This doesn't just apply to measures, by the way, you can also create display folders for normal fields as well. And to do this, you will have to head back to the model view, and then making sure we can find and select our measure. We can do this either in the table view and select it here, or you can select it in the fields list as well. You should find that there's a display folder property in the properties window. So I'm just going to create a display folder. I'm going to call this one film measures, and then hit enter. And you'll see that that folder gets created in the fields list. And that's also in place when I switch back to the report view. So we can see that inside our film table, we've got a film measures folder, and I can expand that to see all of the measures that I've created. Now, if I do create a new measure, I'll need to make sure that that new measure goes into the same display folder. So in order to do that, I'd have to go back to the model view and select the new measure and place the same display folder name in the display folder property for the new measure. And I have to admit that does get a little bit tedious. So rather than creating measures in folders in a data table, I tend to prefer creating separate tables to hold my measures. To start with that, we're going to create a table by choosing to enter some data. So from the Home tab in the ribbon, I'm going to click the Enter Data button. And I'm not actually going to enter any data, I'm sure you'll be pleased to hear. All I'm going to do is change the name of the table that I'm creating. The temptation here is to use the table name measures, but that name is actually already taken. If you try to create a table called measures, it will end up being called measures2 when you load it. So I tend to call my tables either things like film measures and genre measures, or all measures if I want to put everything into one single table. So I'll call the table all measures and then click the load button, and that will eventually create a new table for me in my data model. It won't be connected to anything. It's designed to be empty at the moment. It's got this generic column 1 stored in it, but we'll get rid of that in a moment. Now I'd like to move the measure that I created, my average profit measure, into my all measures table. In order to do that, I'll need to be in either the data view or the report view, so that I can select my average profit measure and see the Measure Tools tab in the ribbon. You'll see there's a property called Home Table for a measure, and I can move my measure from the film table to the All Measures table just by selecting that from the drop-down list. So we should see that my average profit measure, along with its display folder, has now appeared in the All Measures table. At this point, now that I've added something else to the All Measures table, I can happily right-click and delete that column 1. So I can right-click on it and choose Delete from Model, confirm that I do indeed want to do that. And now, because my All Measures table only contains measures, the symbol displayed next to it is different to that of data tables in the data model. Finally, I think I'd just like to get rid of the display folder. If you have an all measures table and you want to organise the measures within it, then by all means, of course, create as many display folders as you like. I just find them a little awkward to work with personally. So I'm going to go back to the data model view, and I'm going to select my average profit measure, and then just delete the text in the display folder text box and hit enter to update that. So there we go, my all measures table with a single measure sitting in it, making it very easy to find the measures when I create new visualizations and I want to add them into the report. Now let's add some more measures to the all measures table. I'd like 4 new measures to calculate the sum, average, min and max of the runtime minutes field from the film table. That may sound like quite a basic set of measures to create, but you shouldn't underestimate the benefits of creating such simple measures. If I did want to show those 4 aggregates for the runtime minutes field, I don't technically need measures to do so. If I created a new table or a new page in my report and then added a new table to it, I'm going to insert the genre field first, and then after I've done that, I can check the box for the runtime minutes field to insert the default aggregation for the runtime minutes, which happens to be the sum. You'll remember from previous videos that you can change the default summarization using the Column Tools tab in the ribbon. If I wanted the average runtime minutes as well, I'd need to drag that runtime minutes field into the table, and then I'd need to change the aggregation to say average, and then if I wanted to change the title, I'd have to change that manually as well. Then again for the min and again for the max. And if I'm likely to use those aggregations multiple times across the same report, that's going to get very tedious. So I'm going to get rid of those 2 fields from my table. And instead I'm going to add a new measure to my all measures table. I can right click on the all measures table in the fields list and choose new measure. I'm going to call this first one total runtime and make this equal to the result of the sum function, referring to the runtime minutes field from the film table. I can then close the round brackets, and then to save myself a little bit of time, I'm just going to copy this measure first and then hit enter to create that one. So there's total runtime. I can then right click all measures and choose new measure, paste in what I've just copied and then just change its name. I'll go with AVG runtime and then use the average function. Then I can hit enter again to create that one. And if you're bored at this point, feel free to skip ahead. You probably know what to do at this point. I want the min and the max as well. So let's have the min function, sorry, the title min followed by the min function. And then, beg your pardon, I don't want the min function in there twice. Try again, there we go. And then one final measure called max runtime, using the max function. Okay, So having done that, it's much easier to add multiple aggregations of the same field to the same object, the same visualization. So I can add total runtime and average runtime, min and max very easily just by clicking and dragging them in. So they're already aggregated with the correct function and with the correct title. It's also possible to reference existing measures in new measures that you create. As a very simple example of that, let's say we wanted to calculate the range of runtimes for any group of films by subtracting the min runtime from the max. To do that, we can add a new measure to the all measures table. I'll call this one runtime range, and I'll make this one equal to the max runtime minus the min runtime. Now, whereas the convention for referencing columns in a table is to start with the table name followed by the name of the column, when you reference measures, the convention is simply to refer to the measure itself using a set of square brackets to contain the name. So I'm going to go max runtime minus min runtime. Having done that, I can press enter, and then I can add the runtime range field to the same table and find the result gets calculated based on the context that the measure finds itself in. Most of the measures you create will be used to display a value in a visual, but you can also use measures to calculate formatting properties such as colours. To demonstrate that, I'm going to add a new page to my report and then drop a new table in there. And in there I'm going to display the genre field and the average runtime field. I'll just do a tiny bit of basic formatting to make this a little easier to read. So with the format pane, I'm going to search for the text properties or any property containing the word text. And then for the grid text size, I'd like to bump this up by a couple of points. So what I'd like to do is compare the average runtime for each context, each filter context, so in this case for each genre. And if that value is less than the overall average runtime of all the films, I want to change the colour of that cell to one colour. If the average runtime for that context is greater than the overall average, then I'll colour it in a different colour. So basic conditional formatting, just using a measure to calculate the colours that we use. To find out what colours I can use, I'm going to, while I have the format pane displayed, search for any colour properties. And watch out UK users, colour is spelt without a U in Power BI. So I found some colour properties. I can click on the drop down arrow for this lovely bright blue colour. And if I click on the More Colours button, it shows me the hex code for that colour. If I want to see the hex code for any other colours, I can simply drag this slider bar to a different colour, and then I can drag the circle around to reposition that as well. So I can generate hex codes very easily just by viewing them in this palette. So now I have a couple of codes I can use. I want to create a measure to calculate them. So I'm going to right click my All Measures table and choose New Measure. And then I'll call this measure AVG Runtime Color, and just because I can, I'm going to spell it with a U. And I'm going to make this one equal to the result of an if function. So my if function is going to compare the value of my average runtime measure and check if that's greater than the number 119.65. And yes, this is a terrible way to do this. We'll look at a much better way to compare these values shortly. But for now, we'll stick with the hard-coded constant number 119.65. I can then type in a comma and then shift and enter. And if the value is greater than the overall average, I want to create that bright blue colour. So in some double quotes, I need to type in a hash 118DFF. A memorable colour code if ever I saw one. And don't forget, if you wanted to remind yourself what any of this code does, you can always add comments in DAX. So at the end of this line, it might be worthwhile adding a couple of / characters and indicate that this is the code for bright blue. Shift and enter then to go down to the next line, and in another set of double quotes, I'm going to go for a bright orange colour, so hash FF9600. Close the double quotes, and then perhaps again add a quick comment to indicate that this is orange. I can then finally close the round brackets and then hit enter to create that measure. Now I simply need to assign that measure to the appropriate formatting property in the visual. So I'm going to go back to the fields list. This is just one way to view the conditional formatting properties. If I right click on the average runtime, I can choose conditional formatting, and I'm going to go with a background color. You may well have seen this dialog box in previous videos in the series where you can set up a combination of rules to choose what colors your various cells should appear in. Here it's much easier. I'm going to just choose a field value, and then from my all measures table choose my average runtime color measure. So the average runtime color measure refers to the average runtime measure, and that will evaluate the average runtime for each context that the measure finds itself in, and compare it with the number 119.65, and then change the background color of the cell appropriately according to whether it's above or below. One of the great things about using a measure to do this sort of thing is that you can reuse that measure in as many different visuals as you like. And then if you decide you want to update your colour scheme, you only have one single place in which you need to do so. I'm just going to quickly copy and paste my table by selecting it and then pressing Ctrl C followed by Ctrl V. Then I'll drag the copy of the table over to the right hand side, resize it. Then I'm going to convert it into a chart. I'll use the clustered column chart visual. Then I'm going to format the chart using the format pane, and in the data colors category, find the default color property and look for the little FX button to the right hand side. This always indicates you can use conditional formatting to set the value of that property. So I can open up that same dialog box we just saw for the conditional formatting in the table, choose field value, point to my all measures table and choose the average runtime color measure. When I click OK, it applies the same conditions and formatting rules as to the table that we copied the chart from. Just for my sanity, I'd like to change the sorting of this so that it's sorted by the genre and sorted in ascending order of genre, so it's in the same order as for the table. I think the columns are perhaps a little bit tall. It seems a little pointless starting each column at the very sort of bottom end, starting at 0. I think we could chop off these columns a little bit closer to the values they represent. So if, with the chart selected in the format pane, find the y-axis category and then look for the start property. It's set to auto by default, but look, there's a little FX button to the right hand side there. So I can click the FX button there, choose to base this on a field value, and this time I'm going to go for my min runtime measure. So I'll choose min runtime, click OK, and then it chops off the unnecessary part at the bottom of the scale. Next, I'd like to take another look at the average runtime color measure. If I select that in the fields list to bring back the formula bar, the part that I want to change is the bit where we just manually typed in the value of the average runtime for all the films regardless of filter context. This is a pretty rubbish way of doing things. What I prefer to do is create a measure that calculates the average runtime for all the films regardless of which genre the film belongs to. So I basically want to modify the filter context so that it ignores the filter context applied by the genre field. This is one of the most powerful things you can do with measures, the ability to modify the filter context to affect which rows get included in the measure's aggregation. This is going to underpin many of the more advanced things we'll do later on in the series. So this is just scratching the surface of some of the things we can do here. I'm going to create a new measure that removes the context or removes the filter applied by the genre field or by the genre table. So to do that, let's create a new measure in the all measures table. And I'm going to call this one AVG runtime, all genres. And I'm going to make this equal to the result of a function called calculate. Doesn't sound like it does much, the calculate function, but trust me, you're going to encounter this one time and time again in your DAX career. What I'd like to calculate is the average runtime, and I can do this in two ways. I can use the average function to calculate the average of the runtime field, or I can refer to my existing average runtime measure. So as I've already calculated that, why not reuse the existing one? Then I'm going to type in a comma before I head down to the next line. And you can hopefully see that this tooltip that appears now says it evaluates the expression in a context modified by filters. I'm on the filter 1 parameter. The way I'd like to modify my filters is by removing one specific filter. And there's a function in DAX called remove filters. You can guess what that does. In some round brackets, I'm going to refer to the genre table. So I'm going to refer to the genre table by selecting it from the list there. I can refer to a specific column in the genre table as well, but that's not really important in this particular example. I'm just going to refer to the entire genre table. Then I can close the round brackets and hit enter. And then just to demonstrate what this is done by itself, if I drag the average runtime all genres field into the table that's currently showing the average runtime, and I can just modify the width of that column so you can clearly see, it doesn't now matter which genre or which filter context is applied by the genre. That measure always calculates the average runtime for all the genres, which is pretty handy. So now what I can do, if I just take that field away from the table, it's pointless displaying it there, that was just to demonstrate. I can now go back to my average runtime color measure, and then I can replace the 119.65 hard-coded constant with a reference to my average runtime all genres. Now the end result for this particular example will be no different whatsoever. We'll get the same things coloured in with the same colours, nothing will change. But we've got the advantage now that if any of the data in our data model changes and this average is updated, then our measures will handle any differences. Now, because our measure only removes the filter from the genre table, it means it will still be affected by filters applied from other tables and fields. To demonstrate that, I'm just going to add a slicer to this page. So I'm going to find the slicer visualization and insert one of those. Now I'll just drag it across to the right-hand side. I should have just enough space to squeeze it in there. And then I'm going to assign the certificate field from the certificate table. Just to demonstrate what's happening as well, I'm going to re-add my average runtime all genres to the original table so we can hopefully see what's going on a little more clearly. So at the moment you can see each genre context is calculating the overall average runtime for all the films in that dataset. If I apply a filter from my slicer based on the certificate field, that will affect the results returned. If I can select the table so you can see it, affects the result returned by the measure. So it will also then affect which cells get coloured in and which columns get coloured in different colours. And you see that happening each time I select a different certificate, it will affect the results. I'll just get rid of the average runtime all genres from the table there. That's pointless having that in there anymore. And then I think the final result behaves fairly sensibly. So my end users, I think, would find that relatively intuitive. And I think the end results would make sense to them as well. Everything's responding to the clicks that we make. So there's our basic introduction to some of the fundamental concepts of working with measures in DAX. Hopefully that gives you a bit of a feel for how measures work and certainly how they're different to the calculated columns we've been working with so far. We'll be revisiting all these techniques and going a lot further with them in later parts of this series, but hopefully that's been useful for now. Thanks very much for watching. See you next time.